Dawn slowly approached over the vast stretch of the Pacific Ocean. The waters around Hawaii shimmered like glass, untouched and peaceful, unaware that history stood moments away from one of its darkest turns. December 7th, 1941, just another quiet Sunday morning for the people of Oahu, yet a day that would soon echo through eternity as the day of infamy. At the heart of this serenity lay Pearl Harbor, America's proud naval base. Battleships, massive steel giants, rested in their berths near Ford Island. The USS Arizona, the California, the Oklahoma, and several others stood silently, their crews either sleeping, attending church services, or preparing for what seemed like a perfectly normal day. Airfields like Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows buzzed with light morning routines, nothing more. But far beyond the Hawaiian horizon, unseen and unheard, death was already on its way. Over 200 miles north of Oahu, a powerful Japanese strike force sliced through the ocean like a silent phantom. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soru, Hiryu Vokaku, and Zukaku, led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, formed the sharp point of Japan's most daring gamble. On their decks sat more than 350 aircraft, engines warmed, pilots focused, waiting for a single command: begin the attack. This moment had not arrived by accident. For months, political tension between the United States and Japan had risen like a tightening rope. Japan's expansion across East Asia and the Pacific had brought it into heavy conflict with American interests. The U.S. embargo on oil and steel had cornered Tokyo's war machine, and now, Japan's leaders believed there was only one path left: strike first, strike hard, and cripple the American Pacific Fleet before it could respond. Back at Pearl Harbor, the American forces remained unaware of the approaching storm. Some radar operators detected a large formation of aircraft shortly after 7 o'clock a.m., but their warnings were brushed aside. The assumption it must be American B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. It was a mistake that would cost dearly. As the Japanese carriers positioned themselves for the perfect launch, Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, leading the first wave, stood ready. His attack plan was precise, timed to the second, designed to hit the Americans in the most devastating manner possible. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters set ready to unleash chaos on Pearl Harbor, hurling the United States into the deadliest war humanity had ever known. But on the ground, life continued as if nothing was amiss. Families prepared breakfast, soldiers cleaned their quarters, officers scanned paperwork. Some sailors leaned casually against the rails of their ships, enjoying the gentle warmth of the morning sun. The calm was almost unnerving, too peaceful, too quiet. High above the Pacific Ocean, the first wave of Japanese aircraft moved in perfect formation, slicing through the morning sky like metallic hawks. More than 180 planes, fighters, dive bombers, and deadly torpedo aircraft rushed toward Oahu with disciplined precision. Each pilot understood the importance of this mission. Japan's empire depended on the success of this single, devastating strike. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, seated in his Nakajima B-5N Kate bomber, scanned the horizon. Below, the island of Oahu slowly emerged from beneath the morning clouds. He could see the green coastline forming, the faint outline of airfields, and the shimmering waters of Pearl Harbor. Everything looked peaceful, unaware, vulnerable. Back at Pearl Harbor, the American fleet rested silently. Sailors aboard the battleships were just beginning their Sunday routines. Some prepared for breakfast, some polished brass, others chatted casually on deck. A few played cards, while others prepared for morning inspections. No one imagined that an enemy was minutes away from striking. Oahu's radar stations had detected something earlier, but communication breakdowns and assumptions had turned a critical warning into nothing more than background noise. The Americans believed the incoming blip on their screen was a group of friendly B-17s. There was no expectation, no imagination that an attack of this magnitude could occur on American soil. As the Japanese formation tightened, the pilots checked their watches. Everything was on schedule. Fukita looked down at Pearl Harbor again. The battleships were lined perfectly, grouped together like stationary giants waiting to be brought down. It was an attack planner's dream. To the north, Japanese fighters prepared to break off and sweep over airfields such as Wheeler, Hickam, and Bellows, with the purpose of eliminating American aircraft before they could even take off. Without air support, the U.S. fleet would be defenseless. Inside the harbor, oil glistened across the water as sailors started up auxiliary engines. On the USS Arizona, chaplains were preparing for Sunday services. On the USS Oklahoma, a small group of sailors joked about weekend shore leave. On the USS West Virginia, some crew members were enjoying their breakfast. Life seemed perfectly normal. The Japanese pilots, however, were moments away from changing everything. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave descended toward Oahu. The rising sun cast long shadows behind the aircraft, making them appear like dark arrows pointed at their targets. Fukita tightened his grip on the radio transmitter. The second wave waiting behind is listening for his signal. Every man knows this moment will echo across the world. Back on the island, a few civilians noticed unusual aircraft overhead. At first, they assumed these were American planes performing routine maneuvers. But their mistake became clear as tiny dots began falling from the first moments of the attack struck Pearl Harbor with the force of a volcano erupting without warning. Torpedo bombers skimmed the surface of the harbor, their propellers slicing inches above the water as they released deadly weapons designed specifically for the shallow depth. A peaceful Sunday morning instantly transformed into a nightmare of fire and steel. At Battleship Row, the heart of the American Pacific Fleet lay exposed. The USS Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia, and the USS California were among the first to feel the impact. Torpedoes slammed into their hulls with terrifying power, each hit sending violent shockwaves throughout the metal giants. Aboard the USS Oklahoma, sailors were thrown from their bunks as the ship lurched violently. The vessel began to list almost immediately, tilting to one side like a wounded beast. Men scrambled for escape, but the flooding was too fast. In mere minutes, the Oklahoma began to roll over, trapping hundreds of sailors inside its steel belly. On the USS West Virginia, chaos unfolded just as brutally. Torpedo after torpedo tore into her port side, ripping open the hull and flooding compartments. Sailors tried to return fire, but the attack was overwhelming. Smoke, flames, and twisted metal filled the air as the ship slowly sank to the harbor floor. Above, dive bombers screamed down in near vertical plunges. Their engines howled like demons as they released high explosive bombs with chilling accuracy. One bomb struck the USS California, sending a column of flames and debris upward. Another slammed into the USS Nevada, tearing open her deck and igniting fuel storage. For the men trapped inside these steel fortresses, survival became a desperate fight against darkness, fire, and rising water. Meanwhile, the USS Arizona, the pride of the fleet, stood at the center of the harbor. She was the symbol of American naval strength. But in war, symbols are often the most vulnerable. A flight of dive bombers circled above her, choosing the perfect angle for their run. Their target, the forward magazines, where thousands of pounds of ammunition lay stored. In the skies above, Japanese fighters strafed the airfields, preventing American aircraft from taking off. At Hickam Field, planes lined up wing to wing were destroyed in seconds. Fireballs erupted as fuel tanks ignited. Airmen running for cover were cut down by machine gun fire. The same chaos struck Wheeler Field and Bellows Field, crippling American air power before a single plane could challenge the attackers. On the ground, sailors, Marines, and airmen fought back with whatever weapons they could reach: machine guns, rifles, even sidearms. Some ships, despite being hit, managed to return fire. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their guns, firing blindly into the sky at screaming dive bombers. Despite all odds, their courage began to carve openings in the enemy assault. The first explosions echoed across Pearl Harbor like the roar of a volcano erupting from beneath the sea. American sailors, jolted from their calm morning routines, rushed onto the decks of their battleships confused, shocked, and struggling to understand what was unfolding around them. What they saw was beyond imagination. Japanese Ichi-D3 Val dive bombers came screaming down from the sky. Their engines shrieked as they plummeted almost vertically, releasing bombs with brutal precision before pulling up sharply, narrowly avoiding the rising towers of smoke. Each explosion sent towering fireballs into the morning sky, turning peaceful blue into burning orange. The first torpedoes hit their targets within seconds. The USS Oklahoma, struck repeatedly on her port side, began to roll dangerously. Sailors scrambled across tilting decks, gripping rails as the ship lurched. Men were thrown into the oily water as Oklahoma began to capsize, hundreds trapped inside her steel hull, pounding desperately from within. Nearby, the USS West Virginia absorbed multiple torpedo hits. Fires erupted across her decks, but her crew fought back, dragging wounded men away from flames, returning fire with anti-aircraft guns that jammed repeatedly from lack of readiness. Still, the sailors fired, even if only to show they would not fall without resistance. Amid the chaos, the mighty USS Arizona was targeted by Japanese bombers from above. One armor-piercing bomb struck near her forward magazine, a hit that sealed her fate. At 8:06 a.m., a massive explosion tore through the ship, splitting her hull and sending a fiery column of smoke rising hundreds of feet into the sky. The blast was so violent that it shook the entire harbor. More than 1,100 men were killed instantly. Sailors on nearby ships felt the shockwave and stared in stunned horror at the burning wreckage. One survivor later described it as the sky itself falling onto the sea. Another sailor, thrown off his ship, rose to the surface to witness Arizona engulfed in flames, its mainmast collapsing, its decks twisted into molten steel. Meanwhile, Japanese Zero fighters swept across Oahu's airfields, strafing runways, destroying rows of parked American aircraft, most lined up perfectly wing to wing, making them easy targets. At Hickam Field, pilots sprinted toward their planes only to find them engulfed in fire. Machine gun bullets tore across the concrete, striking fuel trucks and sending debris flying in every direction. The American response was immediate but chaotic. Anti-aircraft guns were manned by sailors, who sometimes loaded shells upside down in their panic. Ammunition lockers were locked. Keys were missing. Many soldiers fired at planes with rifles, and some even with pistols. Just as the first wave of Japanese aircraft began to withdraw, a new sound filled the sky, a deeper, heavier drone. The second wave was arriving. More than 160 additional aircraft swept toward Oahu, ready to strike targets already engulfed in smoke and fire. Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led this wave. Unlike the first wave, which carried torpedoes, the second focused on high-altitude bombing and fighter sweeps. Their mission: finish what the first wave started and destroy anything still standing. As Japanese aircraft descended toward Pearl Harbor, they found a battlefield transformed by devastation. Columns of black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. Ships burned fiercely. Explosions echoed across the island. Yet despite this inferno, American defenses were no longer silent. Anti-aircraft gunners were ready. The second wave was met with a wall of fire. Shells burst around the Japanese formations, sending shrapnel slicing through the air. Fighter pilots struggled to maintain formation amid the chaos, but still, they pressed on. Dive bombers targeted dry docks and repair facilities, recognizing their strategic importance. At the Navy Yard, the destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs were hit repeatedly. Flames erupted from their hulls as explosions tore through the ships. The battleship USS Pennsylvania, in dry dock, became a primary target. Bombs rained down, smashing through her superstructure and killing dozens of sailors. At Kaneohe Bay, Japanese fighters strafed seaplanes and hangars. Buildings collapsed under machine gun fire. American personnel fought desperately to save equipment and return fire, even as bombs exploded around them. In downtown Honolulu, civilians watched the second wave with horror. Smoke drifted across neighborhoods as bomb fragments fell into streets and yards. Hospitals overflowed with wounded. Roads filled with ambulances, fire trucks, and stunned civilians fleeing toward shelters. At Bellows Field, the second wave inflicted massive destruction. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground, fuel tanks detonated, and runways cratered. Yet American machine gunners held their positions, firing relentlessly at incoming fighters. Across Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots focused on finishing the battleships not yet sunk. The USS Maryland and USS Tennessee, shielded by their neighbors, endured repeated blasts, but remained afloat. The USS California, struggling with flooding, took additional hits. Fires raged. Smoke rolled across decks. Still, crew members refused to abandon their posts. One of the most dramatic moments came when a Japanese dive bomber, struck by anti-aircraft fire, spiraled out of control and crashed near the dry docks. The explosion shook the ground, sending shockwaves through already weakened structures, though the second wave continued to inflict severe damage. As Pearl Harbor choked under smoke and flames, the Japanese second wave roared into view. These pilots had been waiting for the signal from the first wave now. Seeing the harbor engulfed in destruction, they understood their role clearly: finish the job. This wave targeted what remained: airfields, fuel depots, shipyards, anything that could allow the Americans to recover quickly. Dive bombers approached from high altitude, engines screaming as they released their deadly payloads. Hickam Field was hit again. Hangars collapsed. Barracks were shredded. Medical crews rushed wounded soldiers into trucks as fresh bombs shook the ground. At Pearl Harbor, anti-aircraft defenses had finally mobilized. Guns that had been silent now erupted with furious fire. Shells burst across the sky, filling the air with black puffs of smoke. Many Japanese aircraft were hit, spiraling into the harbor or crashing into hillsides. But the second wave still pressed on, delivering strike after strike. On the USS Pennsylvania, one of the few battleships in dry dock, sailors manned anti-aircraft guns with ferocity. Their fire tore into incoming planes, but bombs continued to fall nearby. The destroyers USS Cassin and USS Downs were heavily damaged, erupting into flames. Civilian areas were not spared. Houses near the harbor shook violently as bombs fell. Glass shattered. Windows blew open. Families hid beneath tables and beds, unsure of what was happening or whether the explosions would stop. Even so, American resistance grew stronger. Machine gunners at Wheeler Field opened fire across the runways, shooting down multiple Japanese aircraft. Some American pilots, flying outdated P-36 fighters, managed to take off through smoke-filled skies and engage the enemy in brief, intense dogfights. But nothing could hide the reality: Pearl Harbor had been caught unprepared. The second wave circled the harbor, surveying the destruction left behind. Battleships lay smoking and broken. Hangars were rubble. Airfields were burning. Oil covered the water in thick layers. Sailors ran across decks, dragging hoses, firing guns, and saving whoever they could. Pearl Harbor was no longer a peaceful naval base. It had transformed into a hellish landscape of fire, smoke, and devastation. The first wave had struck with overwhelming force, but the nightmare was far from over. As burning oil spread across the water and explosions echoed from ship to ship, American sailors fought desperately to survive. Many sought cover, others ran toward the chaos to save their friends. No one had time to understand what was happening. They only knew one truth: the world had changed in an instant. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, rising thousands of feet like a pillar of darkness. The once blue Hawaiian morning now resembled a war-torn battlefield. Battleships groaned under the weight of destruction. The USS Arizona still burned violently, its deck shattered, its men trapped beneath blazing steel. Nearby, the USS Tennessee and USS West Virginia struggled to stay afloat, fire spreading across their decks as sailors battled flames with hoses, buckets, and even their bare hands. Across the harbor, the USS Nevada attempted something that no other battleship dared. She began moving. Engines roared to life as her crew fought to steer her toward the open sea. Smoke choked the air, but the men refused to abandon their ship. As the Nevada moved slowly through the harbor, she became a symbol of desperate American resistance. But the Japanese were watching. High above, enemy dive bombers spotted the Nevada's movement. A battleship leaving the harbor would become a massive headline, a morale blow Japan wanted to avoid. They swung back into formation and prepared another attack run. Within seconds, exploding bombs tore across the ship's decks. The Nevada slowed, then stalled. Her captain ordered her grounded to avoid sinking and blocking the harbor entrance. She slid into the mud, still burning, still defiant. Elsewhere, chaos unfolded at every corner of Oahu. Hickam field burned as American aircraft sat crushed and shattered on the runways. Hangars collapsed in flames. Firefighters sprinted through the wreckage, dodging bullets and falling debris. Soldiers fired back at the sky whenever they could, using machine guns, rifles, even pistols, anything that could shoot. In the harbor's waters, dozens of sailors struggled to stay alive. The oil-slick surface caught fire again and again, trapping men between the flames and the enemy. Bullets raining down from above. Rescue boats zigzagged frantically, dragging survivors aboard while dodging debris and explosions. Everywhere, men screamed orders, prayers, warnings. Explosions drowned out voices. Steel rained from the sky. Ships that had stood proudly only minutes earlier were now twisted ruins. Yet, amid all this destruction, something remarkable emerged: courage. Sailors jumped into burning waters to rescue their trapped crewmates. Medics created makeshift hospitals on sidewalks, lawns, and gym floors. Civilians rushed out of their homes too. By around 9:45 a.m., the Japanese attack began to withdraw. Commander Mitsuo Fukita circled one last time, surveying the destruction below. Battleships lay shattered. Airfields burned. Columns of smoke spiraled into the sky. Fukita radioed the carriers. Mission accomplished. Japanese aircraft regrouped over the Pacific before turning back toward their fleet, leaving behind a harbor engulfed in flames. On the ground, the United States started to awaken from the shock. Sirens wailed across Honolulu. Medics rushed into burning buildings. Sailors formed rescue teams, cutting into overturned ships to reach trapped crewmen. Hospitals overflowed within minutes. Despite the destruction, American forces quickly began organizing. Anti-aircraft crews stayed at their guns in case a third wave arrived. Civilian volunteers flooded into bases offering help. Firefighters, soldiers, civilians, everyone joined in the desperate fight to save lives. Inside the harbor, small boats moved through burning oil slicks to rescue survivors. Some sailors swam through flames to pull others to safety. Even in tragedy, courage burned bright. As Japanese aircraft vanished over the horizon, one truth became clear: this attack would not weaken America's resolve, it would ignite it. The attack on Pearl Harbor had already plunged the harbor into fire and smoke. But the most tragic moment of the entire assault was still approaching. The battleship USS Arizona, one of the pride jewels of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sat anchored quietly near Ford Island, its massive hull steady, unaware that it was about to become the symbol of America's entry into World War II. The first wave of Japanese aircraft had already struck several battleships, but the Arizona, though damaged, remained afloat. Her crew, shaken yet determined, scrambled across the decks, manning anti-aircraft guns, shouting commands, and preparing to defend the ship. Many sailors rushed from their quarters, still half-dressed, desperate to join the fight. Others, trapped deep within the ship, waited anxiously for orders. Above them, a formation of Japanese dive bombers, Alichi D-3A Vals, turned toward the Arizona. Their mission was clear: deliver a decisive, crippling blow. Leading them was a bomber carrying a modified armor-piercing bomb, once an actual 16-inch naval shell, reforged for a single purpose: penetrate a battleship's armored deck. Inside the Arizona, Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg and Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd stood on the bridge, assessing the chaos unfolding around them. They issued rapid commands, directing the crew despite the deafening roar of explosions and shrapnel. Even as the ship took hits, they refused to abandon their posts. At exactly 8:06 a.m., the Japanese bomber released its deadly payload. Sailors aboard nearby ships saw it falling straight, steady, merciless. The bomb pierced the Arizona's forward deck near turret number 2. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the world erupted. A titanic explosion ripped through the heart of the Arizona, as the forward magazine holding hundreds of thousands of pounds of gunpowder ignited in an instant. A massive fireball burst from the ship, shooting hundreds of feet into the air. The explosion shattered steel, splintered decks, and sent shockwaves across the harbor. Men were thrown into the water. Others disappeared instantly in the inferno. Flames engulfed the ship from bow to stern, towering higher than the masts themselves. The blast was so violent that sailors on distant ships felt the heat strike their faces. Like a blast furnace, the Arizona's entire forward section collapsed, sinking rapidly as smoke billowed skyward. Within seconds, over 1,100 crew members, nearly the entire ship's complement, were gone. On ships nearby, stunned survivors paused in disbelief. A junior officer aboard the USS Tennessee later said it felt as if the first bombs hit Pearl Harbor with a force that ripped the morning apart. At 7:55 a.m., the peaceful island erupted under a storm of explosions as Japanese aircraft unleashed their deadly payloads. The harbor, moments ago calm and silver under the Hawaiian sun, transformed into a battleground drowned in smoke, flames, and chaos. Japanese torpedo bombers flew barely inches above the water, navigating with terrifying precision. Their targets were clear Battleship Row, where the heart of the American Pacific Fleet lay anchored. The USS California, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and USS Nevada lined the harbor like steel titans. But on this day, they were exposed, still, and unprepared. The first torpedo struck the USS Oklahoma with devastating impact. Within minutes, the mighty battleship began to list dangerously. Sailors scrambled for escape as seawater rushed into its lower decks. Some tried to climb up ladders. Others attempted to pry open hatches, now jammed from the explosions. In less than 12 minutes, the Oklahoma rolled over completely, trapping hundreds of sailors inside its hull. Near it, the USS West Virginia took multiple torpedoes as well, each strike sending violent tremors across the water. Fires erupted instantly, and black smoke roiled upward. Yet the crew fought to keep the ship afloat, closing watertight doors and battling flames that spread across the deck. Above them, Japanese Aichi D-3 Val dive bombers began their terrifying descents. Their engines screamed as they dove toward the harbor at steep angles. Sailors who looked up saw the sun vanish behind the silhouettes of falling aircraft. The sound was a mixture of roaring engines, whistling bombs, and the thunder of destruction. On the USS Arizona, sailors sprinted to their battle stations. But the ship's ammunition magazines were full, and its defenses were not fully manned. When a Japanese bomb pierced the forward deck and detonated inside the magazine, the Arizona exploded with unimaginable force. The blast tore the ship apart, sending a massive fireball into the sky and a shockwave across the harbor. The explosion was so violent that observers miles away felt the ground shake. The fireball that consumed the Arizona was followed by burning oil that spilled into the water. The harbor became a sea of flames. Sailors who jumped into the water found themselves swimming through fire. The USS Nevada, though hit, attempted something few expected. It tried to escape. With steam rising from its engines and smoke trailing behind, the Nevada moved toward the harbor entrance, determined not to be trapped and destroyed at anchor. But as enemy planes noticed its movement, they redirected their attack toward it, marking it as a priority target. Everywhere across Pearl Harbor, sailors fought desperately. Some manned anti-aircraft guns and fired back despite the overwhelming odds. Others dragged wounded men to safety. A few